I think it may be DeSantis, Jonathan. I think that Republicans, and I say this as somebody who thinks highly of the former president in many ways, but it may be that his moment has passed. They seem to think that what the status quo is good enough, based on these midterms. I guess, the inflation and the chaotic border and the unwinnable war and the crime is good enough for them.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We're recording this the day after the midterm elections and have a lot to talk about today with journalist Heather Robinson, who covered some of the races for JNS. We're going to break down the 2022 results, the implications for the Jewish community in Israel, as well as how it's going to impact the 2024 race. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And also, remember to tune in every day or log in on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms for Top Story Daily Edition, where you can hear me not just once a week, but 5 times a week. If that's not too much for you, I don't know what to say. At any rate, here we are. Heather Robinson is our guest today. Heather is a regular contributor, news features to New York Post, as well as the Jewish News Syndicate. She's appeared as a commentator on Fox News, Heraldo at Large, Fox News Radio's Fox Across America with Jimmy Faya, and CNN's Anderson Cooper 360. Heather, welcome to Top Story.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you.
Thanks for coming on and for all of your great reporting that we ran in the last week about the races. Now let's sort of break it down, like what happened. Now, I'll just start by saying, well, I guess it wasn't a red wave. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, yes, my predictions weren't too good, but they're just predictions. But what we have now is a political stalemate. And I'll just open by saying, I think that if anybody was looking for clarity in our political discourse, for sort of a break from the culture wars, this bifurcated system with a tribal culture war between the two parties where people no longer think their friends, neighbors, relatives who disagree with them are just mistaken. They think they're evil. We got so much more of that in the midterms. And my prediction is we're going to get even more of it. So let's start by asking, we're going to break down some of the races. Heather, you covered some of them. What happened in New York? Tell us about the gubernatorial race and Lee Zeldin, how he did, and I guess how he fell short.
I think, Jonathan, really in a phrase, what happened was the overturn of Roe v. Wade. That's my overall analysis. I mean, I think that, look, Zeldin was something of a long shot anyway. New York's a very, very blue state. I mean, the city, of course, makes it a blue state. And, a lot of New York City women who I've spoken with in recent weeks, whose top concern is abortion rights. All, personal thoughts aside, I mean, I do think that, as a practical matter, hurt the Republicans very much in these midterms. And I think we have the old New York tradition of liberalism, the Democratic Party. People are very ideologically wedded to this. And I think that things have to get very dire in New York for many people to vote for a Republican. I personally think that's a shame because we have really a one-party dominance here. that at best leads to inefficiency, at worst produces all kinds of corruption. I think it's a mistake for New Yorkers to be this knee jerk, but I think that these are the factors. There's the old loyalty to the party, with this new wokeism, and what I see as a kind of a kind of a brainwashing, to tell you the truth. In my honest analysis, I just think people are, told that, if they are good people and they value diversity, they vote Democrat. And even though I think Lee Zeldin is a moderate and a great guy, and I think it's minority communities who are hurt worst and first when crime gets out of control. I guess there just wasn't enough to put him over. So I think that's what happened.
Yeah, I think the demographics here are, really, they sort of dominate it. I mean, New York really for the last really the last 2 centuries is, ever since Aaron Burr helped found Tammany Hall, it's been a democratic state. Um, but it was capable of flipping at times even within the last half century. Um, Reagan carried it twice. George Pataki won the governorship 3 times, and that was the last time the Republicans won a statewide race, his third term in 2002. But the state has changed since then, just as other states have changed as well, and we'll get to that more. Florida used to be sort of a swing state for a long time. Now it appears to be a deep red state. And as some have pointed out, perhaps it's even redder because of all the Republicans or people who might vote Republican who left New York and moved to Florida. I don't know if I don't know if the numbers were that great to make a difference along those lines, but I think there is some of that. I think also, you alluded to it, these people being brainwashed, but I think we live in a very really hyper partisan era where people are loyal to their political party. It comes first for them, and they would rather do anything than vote for a party. One of my favorite statistics, I love to cite it because I think it tells us so much, is that in the 1950s, Gallup, when they first started tracking attitudes towards intermarriage, there were overwhelming majorities of Americans who said that they would never, approve of their children marrying someone of a different race or a different religion. Today, the same overwhelming majorities purport not to care about it. That's probably true about religion. It might even be true about race, although maybe people lie about that. But what they don't approve of is the idea of their children or themselves marrying someone from a different political party. So I think part of what we saw in this midterm, not just in New York, but everywhere, is that these partisan loyalties run so deep that it's very hard. There aren't that many persuadable people in the middle anymore. There aren't very many swing voters around the country. They exist, but
Yeah.
not in the numbers that they used to.
Yes, and so what you have is fact and concrete action plans and proposals for reform and change, and doing things matter less than ideologies. And I think that's everybody's loss, because you want public servants to be effective and you want government to serve the people. And if government leaders are basically like these religious figures that people worship and don't expect results from, I think that's going to work to the detriment of good government. So I really would wish that people would actually study the issues more, and study the concrete specific proposals that different politicians have. I mean, I think the ultimate example of it is Oprah telling people, to vote for Fetterman, not citing one concrete reason or policy as to why, just saying trust your discernment, and your discernment presumably is that Oprah said so. I mean, she didn't get even,
Well, that tends to work for like her book recommendations and everything else she tells people to do.
yeah, but
People
it's
people
like,
read her magazine, watch her show. That they've done what they took. No, I don't know that Oprah really had much impact on the voters of Pennsylvania. We'll get to Pennsylvania a little later, but I think you're right in that it's just people sport politics to some extent is sort of like sports for a lot of people. They root for their team. They don't care. Jerry Seinfeld likes to say that in baseball we root for laundry, not for players. You root for the uniform. You're either on team blue or team red, and that's clearly the case in for most people when it comes to politics. And then they won't consider voting from somebody from the other party. Now, Lee Zeldin did certainly much better than any Republican has done in 20 years. He got maybe 47%. That's an amazing total. I mean,
yes,
had not some Republican pollsters who got a lot of races wrong this year. We can talk about pollsters later too. I think we would just be saying, "Wow, what a great showing."
yes,
There was actually some expectation that he might actually win, and maybe that was always unrealistic. But he certainly did better. There must have been some persuadables.
yes,
The Republicans did win seats on Long Island, House seats in Long Island and upstate. It was not a wipeout for them, but I think when it matched up against someone like Kathy Hochul, who was up until the last year a complete unknown, a corrupt politician. She's involved. I wrote about it myself. I know you've done, about the Buffalo Stadium deal that was benefiting her husband, and it just, she's terrible. But even so, that didn't matter. People voted for her because she has D after her name, and because there were some issues, as you say, especially in a state like New York, like abortion, where that actually made the difference.
I think women were spooked, Jonathan, very spooked. And I think it's more personally, I mean, I do understand the concern, but I think it's more emotion than logic based. I think in New York, as Zeldin said, he doesn't have the desire or the power to change, abortion. I mean, law. I think my understanding is it would have to be like a majority in the legislature, and so it was more, I think, a matter of fear, and this slippery slope idea, and like this idea that it's going to turn into the Handmaid's Tale. And I don't mean to sound dismissive of people's concerns, but I do think that was a big blow to the Republicans. But as you said, expectations are almost everything, right? I think that because some of us got our hopes up, and thought that there might be a chance for, not just because of partisan reasons, but for the sake of quality of life in a place like New York. I mean, I think, now we're disappointed, but I give credit, tremendous credit to Zeldin. This is how our democracy is supposed to work. We're supposed to have good people competing. And, if there's a monopoly on, one party rule, it's to everyone's detriment. So hopefully maybe his having run will work toward prompting her, Hochul, and the rest of the Democrats around here. They got some stiff competition. Maybe they'll do a better job. Maybe it will prompt some improvement in their performance. I hope.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Clearly they have work to do as far as crime and other issues as quality
Yes.
of life. New York is a one-party state, as you said. There are veto-proof majorities for the Democrats in both the state assembly and the state senate. They have all the state offices. There hasn't been much incentive for them to change. It's not clear to me whether this is a good enough scare that will make them change or scare them out of woke politics, because the New York Democratic Party is very left wing. Let's talk a little bit about the Jewish vote. Now, we don't have numbers. Nobody, the national exit polls didn't try to measure Jewish vote, or at least I haven't seen any numbers on that yet. But Zeldin did seem to make some inroads, among Jewish voters. Certainly not maybe in the People's Republic of Manhattan, but in other parts of New York. What was your take on that?
Well, I interviewed a bunch of Jewish voters. I did some sort of unscientific polling, and I think that there were certainly strong pockets of support for him among the religious communities in Brooklyn. I know there were issues around the schools, and he favored allowing more autonomy to the yeshivas. That was a big deal for a lot of communities who came out in force. And just anecdotally, some of the Jewish voters I spoke with, like I said, the Jewish women I spoke with, unless they were conservatives, real conservatives, all voted for Hochul. There was a big push among Jewish women because they're concerned about abortion rights. And I think that I don't mean to keep saying over and over, but I think that was a huge driver of women to the polls in New York. Almost
Well,
every.
I think in certain places, in certain demographic groups, I don't think there's any question that you're right about that. Now, nationally, it's hard to say. Abortion is an issue that has always gotten, there's single issue voters sort of, there have traditionally been as many single issue pro-life voters as pro-choice voters, and maybe even a little bit more pro-life voters. That may have changed a little bit this year, but abortion didn't stop Republicans from winning in other places, but there are places where it may have made a difference.
I think it did, Jonathan. I think it did in New York. Listen, if it hadn't been for that, would Zeldin have won? If it hadn't been for the Supreme Court's decision, probably not. But okay, well, yeah, I just know that every woman I spoke with was like getting to the polls, and that was a huge driver, of people turning out. I think that the timing of the Supreme Court's decision was unfortunate in terms of the midterms for the Republicans. That's just my take on it. And as far as other Jewish voters' priorities, I spoke with a few people who said that they hadn't even realized Zeldin was Jewish. I guess maybe, he really wanted to focus on the issues, and he certainly makes no secret of being Jewish, but I guess it wasn't a big, he didn't use it in his campaign, I don't think, at least not to the degree that somebody like Schumer does, for instance.
Heather, I know we were talking about partisanship and how people have just basically just they stick with their party. I think that's clearly the case in New York. As you said, there are other issues that help influence that. Let's talk a little about Pennsylvania now. I think some people were surprised by the fact that John Fetterman was able to pull out and win that Senate seat. I think there are some interesting factors, I think, that went into it. I think one is the fact that 700,000 people voted before the debate between Fetterman and Dr. Oz, and therefore didn't get to see, how, a rather dismal performance on Fetterman's part and perhaps draw conclusions about his fitness for office. But again, I think partisanship played a part. And I think there's something else that I think people who don't live in Pennsylvania, you're from Pittsburgh. I've lived in the Philadelphia area for the last 24 years, although I'm from New York. And that is, the question of people who are not from Pennsylvania. I think the carpetbagger issue actually did really hurt Dr. Oz.
Yeah, I think it did, Jonathan. I think it's a shame. One thing that a lot of people didn't know is that Dr. Oz went to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, and he did live in Philadelphia for several years. His wife and her whole family are from Pennsylvania, and I'm not sure why he didn't talk about that more. I think he did talk about it some. I can't say that it was a total surprise to me. I've been spending quite a bit of time in small town Pennsylvania, and I saw, even in very conservative areas, Fetterman signs. I think that Fetterman's whole kind of image as the regular guy which he's really not. But I think that
Yeah, he
did
was sort of he sort of cosplays a working class fellow, even though he's
right.
anything but.
You know,
But
he's a a big sort of burly, tough looking guy, and he talks the talk of like the working folk. He had some ad making fun of Oz for referring to vegetables as crudité, but the point of the ad was that vegetables are so expensive because inflation is horrible, even for necessities, which is a very important point. But the point was, lost on some in favor of this ridiculing Oz as this elitist because in Pennsylvania we don't call it crudité, we call it a veggie tray, and I never even heard that word in my life, and so I think stuff
yeah,
like that, see, silly and lacking in substance though it is, maybe some of that resonated, and I think Pennsylvania is not as conservative a state as the rest of the Midwest, right? I mean, we're kind of between the East
it's the
Coast and
North
the
Atlantic. It's Mid Atlantic, and I think certainly the comparison to New York when it comes to the carpetbagging thing is very apt. I mean, twice in the last half century, New Yorkers have elected a carpetbagger to the United States Senate. In
big
1964,
time.
Robert Kennedy, who had no connection really to New York, parachuted in to win a Senate seat. At a time when the Kennedy name couldn't have meant any more, within a year of his brother's assassination, and nobody seemed to care about the fact that he was a carpetbagger. 22 years ago, Hillary Clinton parachuted into New York to win a Senate seat. I mean, she put a Yankees cap on and said that she was a Yankees fan. Nobody believed it, but also nobody cared because New York is a bit more cosmopolitan. Um, the baseball analogy is apt. If you go to a baseball game, to a Mets game or a Yankees game, there are always fans for the other team because people who live in New York. Many of them are from someplace else. People go to New York. Um, Philadelphia, by comparison, is no offense to my friends and neighbors, is a pretty parochial place. It is a place where people are from. They don't move away that much, or at least maybe a little more than they used to. But it is a place. It's a sense of place is very important. And Philadelphia is probably the most cosmopolitan place in Pennsylvania. James Carville likes to say that it's Alabama in between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And so I think the question that Oz wasn't from there mattered. But again, I think partisanship played a part. Maybe abortion helped scared away some suburban women voters from him. And, he was also a completely, nobody, he was just some guy on TV. Maybe that worked for Donald Trump. But to become a politician straight off from being, a TV doctor, I think was more than a stretch. And I think there's some Republicans who probably blame Donald Trump for sort of helping impose a choice on them. Not that the other Republicans in the Republican primary were that formidable, but again, it was a question of a candidate who wasn't that good. Now, interestingly, I met, I'm a doctor. I know you interviewed, you met Dr. Oz. I heard him as well. He made a great big pitch to the Jewish community and to get pro-Israel voters. Had he been elected, he would have been the first Muslim U.S. senator, and he would have been the first. The irony would have been that it would have been the first Muslim U.S. senator who was a pro-Israel senator. That's not to be. But I think outside of Jewish Republicans, who voted for him and probably would have voted for any Republican, Dr. Oz discovered the same thing that Donald Trump has discovered, although, again, Donald Trump keeps complaining about it. The fact is that being pro-Israel doesn't necessarily guarantee you Jewish votes, does it?
It's, I guess not, and that's a shame. And I keep thinking as I'm listening to you, Jonathan, I wrote down, now politics goes back to the politicians. I mean, people say they don't want people who are just rubber stamping and upholding the status quo and won't change anything or improve anything. But that is what people want. I'm sorry to sound cynical, but people just elect career politicians. I give a lot of credit to somebody who's had a successful career in another field. I happen to believe that is much more congruent with the founders' vision for our republic. I don't think, the founders foresaw people, the vast majority of our elected officials being people who've never held any other jobs other than to be in public life.
Like the aforementioned Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, just voting on things their whole life. I mean, I don't mean to demean the job of a senator. I'm just saying I think there is a lot to be said for somebody who doesn't have to do this to have a paycheck and have his ego satisfied. I think someone who's made it in another field, that that person is resourceful and driven and smart and capable and has a range of experience. And I think that these people who I prefer somebody like that in public life. I think we saw with the Trump presidency, whatever you think of his personality, I mean, he got a lot done. Lowest minority unemployment in American history, no new wars, solid support for Israel, and some innovative policy to actually move things in a real peacemaking direction there with the Abraham Accords and the relocation of the U.S. Embassy. We saw some bold action and some actual change and improvement in people's lives. But it seems like someone from the outside can have a better shot at actually improving and changing things. And so I really feel that it's a loss that we've gone back to politics for the politicians. This is what the people have chosen for now, and I think they're going to regret it. I think things will probably deteriorate further. Heaven forbid, but I just hope that people do elect some doers in 2024.
Well, I think there are probably more non-politicians going to be in the next Congress than in the past ones. There's more outliers, sort of the J.D. Vances.
Yes,
There are more people
that's
like that
true.
who have been elected. And I think, it goes to the point. I think it actually goes beyond the question of, somebody from outside of politics, not being just a career politician and bringing other disciplines to it. I think when people are career politicians and certainly are career members of Congress, they tend to be sort of members of the uniparty, which is sort of
Mm-hmm.
that
Establishment.
Congress exists to sustain itself and to just keep the machine running rather than to actually change things, rather than to actually act on what their voters want them to do. And I think that's a major part of what sort of the revolution within the Republican Party that Trump, to some extent, helped engender. And I think a lot of the pushback against the sort of outlier candidates, because remember, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell was very disparaging of some of the sort of Trump candidates for the Senate. And now, as it turns out, some of his concerns about electability probably were not off base. Maybe a stronger candidate in Arizona would have won that seat. Maybe a stronger candidate in Pennsylvania would have beaten Fetterman. But it still goes to a question of what do we want from our politicians? What do we want from Congress at a time when, there is a real crisis in terms of the information state, the power, the corporate power. I think there are a lot of people, certainly a lot of conservatives, beginning to contemplate the question of that maybe out of control corporations, especially the Silicon Valley oligarchs and big tech, are a greater threat to individual freedom than government is, which is why perhaps those big tech companies should be broken up. And but that's something that a lot of the career politicians won't do, because they've been taking contributions from lobbyists for the big tech companies, and who are all ex-politicians themselves. In fact, I think Google's lead lead lobbyist in Washington is Susan Molinari, who's an ex-Republican congressman from Staten Island and daughter of another congressman, and wife of another former congressman. The
Nice
gravy
careers
train just keeps
for all
everybody
those,
moving.
right? Nice careers for all those people and their children and their relatives, but I'm not so sure what it does for the American people, Jonathan. A lot of
Yeah.
wars that haven't gone well, a lot of a permanent underclass in this country that can't seem to get a break and get real opportunity. Decade after decade after decade, we have these intractable, massive social problems. Now we have, runaway inflation, another war that I don't see any way to win anytime soon. So, the politicians are continuing to, they have, their great careers. They're going to write books. They're going to give speeches and get paid a lot of money. But I'm not so sure anything's going to, change for the better for the American people in terms of, the economy and governance. I hate to sound like a pessimist. I think you're right. We did see some good quality candidates make a good showing, and I think that will work to to maybe promote. We don't want a monopoly in government. We don't want we want these politicians to know that that they're not safe and secure in there forever doing the same old stuff. And yeah, I think J.D. Vance winning in Ohio is a bright spot, and I think that Zeldin's. I think you're right that he did make a very good showing here, and I give him a lot of credit.
Let's talk now about the Pennsylvania governor's race, which certainly was a big victory for the Democrats, but sort of Jewish issues and sort of the question of anti-Semitism played a role in that. Tell us a little bit about how that unfolded between Josh Shapiro, who is the Pennsylvania Attorney General and very much identified with the Jewish community,
Yes, he is.
and Doug Mastriano, the Republican, who got himself in a lot of trouble with the Jewish community.
Yes, well, Josh Shapiro, he certainly, I'll tell you what, I'm not universally a fan, but there's no question he's a very strongly identified Jewish guy. He's observant. His kids go to Jewish schools. He's, and he's
one of them was in a class with my daughter. So yes,
that's nice. And yes, Mastriano was. I mean, he gave a contribution to a site called Gab, which is, a website that its founder says exists to promote speech and, is a very much a free-for-all open sort of forum. And there is a lot of anti-Semitism on there. I visited the site and checked it out. And this man, Andrew Torba, who runs the site, is an anti-Semite. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, he's saying he won't give interviews to non-Christian journalists. He won't speak to those people. However, he would probably deny being an anti-Semite. He would probably say that that's just reality, but whatever. So essentially what happened was that Mastriano had contributed something to his site. He made these very far, fetched comments about not speaking to reporters who weren't Christian. And the day after that, Mastriano distanced himself and said, made a statement on Twitter, I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't have any more contact with that website. Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. So, Mastriano did make a clear statement, but there was still a perception among the Jewish community that because he had given money to this site, which is where Robert Bowers, the Tree of Life, alleged shooter, had been active in the days before murdering 11 Jews at Tree of Life in 2018. The Jewish community is clearly traumatized by that and upset, and he became associated, Mastriano, with this site, with this terrible controversy. And he wasn't able to shake it. And I don't know, personally, I don't really feel like I know the truth about whether he's anti-Semitic or not. Mastriano, I'm talking about, because he did say I don't want anything to do with this guy. But I tried to reach out to him on behalf of JNS, and I did hear back from the campaign that they might call me. They didn't in the end. So, but in terms of the Jewish community, yes, there was a sense, a perception, right or wrong, that that he's kind of in bed with anti-Semites, and so most of the Jews in Pennsylvania I know, not all, but the vast majority, including conservative, Republican Jews, voted for Shapiro.
Or didn't
Um,
vote at all for
yeah,
governor. Yeah,
or did
I think I think part of Mastriano's problem, in terms of, you say he couldn't seem to get himself out of it, in part because he was following the Trump pattern when it comes to gaffes. Donald Trump never apologizes,
yeah,
because even when or explains himself, because he believes that to do so is a waste of time. That his opponents will still demonize him. That it
yes,
doesn't matter how many times he condemns anti-Semitism, you'll still be
I
called an
think
anti-Semite.
true.
And he's
Yes,
probably right about that. But even so, it's, if you don't say, "Wait a minute, that was wrong," okay,
he did though, Jonathan.
people are actually mostly fine if you apologize and just say, "Well, I made a mistake." But if you follow that, never apologize, it's sort of like something out of a John Wayne movie. Never apologize, it's a sign of weakness. You never get yourself out of dust ups like that, and certainly that's where Mastriano was. And I think it was also interesting at one point when he was questioned about this, and his wife was standing by him, and she then piped up, "But we probably love Israel more than a lot of Jews do." And of course, they got heat for that. Now, it may well be that they are, because they're conservative Republicans. The Republican Party is now sort of a lockstep pro-Israel party. It's likely that they are, people who love Israel, and and they may well love Israel more than a lot of sort of liberal or secular Jews who don't care about it. But that didn't that just still not going to win you any Jewish votes if you're identified in some ways with people who are anti-Semites.
yeah. I mean, I feel like, if you look at his statement, maybe it wasn't. I don't remember if he said he was sorry. You may be right that he didn't actually apologize, but he was
Well, I
clear.
wrote a column about it at the time, and he just he
He said,
wouldn't he would only go so far. He was sort of following the Trump pattern.
to me, it was pretty clear. He said, I'm not anti Semitic and I don't have any more contact with that site. I think something like that. He didn't say, I apologize for ever giving money. I guess he could have said something like that, gone a little further and said, I'm appalled. He didn't do that. But I think he was clear that he didn't, believe in it or want to continue an association, and that he wasn't anti Semitic. To be honest with you, I'm not sure that that's inadequate. I think it's a clear statement, but yes, I think the practical reality was that the stench of that clung to him as far as the Jewish community. And yes, when his wife said that, it struck me as a pretty ingenuous statement on her part. I personally think she should have just said, "We love Israel," and left it at that.
Left the Jews out of it, right?
Yeah,
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 yeah. It got her sort of in the same trouble that Trump did when he said, when he talked about evangelicals, loving Israel more than the Jews. Well, of course he was
yeah.
right. There was,
Uh-huh.
he's what he said was entirely accurate, but it's sort of, it started a
It's
controversy
not
from
true of
which,
all Jews. We know plenty of us love Israel deeply.
right.
So it's an overgeneralization, and it really
Hmm.
isn't fair.
Yeah.
And it is. I can understand where some Jews are offended. I personally wasn't, because I feel like Trump's, we know he's outspoken. He puts his foot in his mouth sometimes, but he's saying what he believes, and I value that as opposed to somebody who's always polishing the statement and it's all fake. And but I am with you that I think people get into trouble when they make sweeping generalizations about groups of people and what we believe. Many of us deeply love Israel, and so
Yes. Well, the thing is with Trump and his gaffes, what he picked up on, and what many, sort of the media still don't get, is that the things that drive his detractors crazy when he says, outrageous things, or make indulges in hyperbole or insults, is that it generally delights the people who like him because he's outraging the establishment, he's
Well,
outraging
yeah,
the
no one's
media.
ever talked
They
back to
love
this.
that.
I mean, right. They're not used to being talked back. The establishment, I mean, people on both sides generally don't call them out, on their foibles, especially in such a blunt manner. And so, this has never happened before. That's hence their characterization of it is as, not normal and a threat to democracy. Basically, they're being talked back to. I mean, they are used to saying, pretty much whatever they want about conservative America. And, that's fine. But, when somebody speaks bluntly to them, it's like the end of the world. So,
Yeah, it's a double standard. There's no question. Now, Heather, you reported on a congressional race in Western Pennsylvania, and I think it was very interesting, and in that it was kind of a test case of how what happens when sort of an anti-Israel Democratic candidate is then opposed by a pro-Israel Republican. Um, does it really change the votes? Can that make the difference in a race? That involved, Representative Summer Lee in Western Pennsylvania. Tell us about that race that you covered for
yes.
JNS.
Yes, well, I interviewed a lot of voters in Pennsylvania, the district that Pittsburgh is in, because there's a congressional seat that was up for grabs, and the Democrat running Summer Lee is regarded as a very far left radical. She's tweeted about, against support for Israel in the midst of the last war. She characterized Biden as a racist and tweeted in favor of dismantling the Democratic Party. So this alarmed a lot of people, including even more moderate Democrats in Pennsylvania. But there was a lot of momentum behind her. She obviously won the primary back in the spring. And at that time, I wrote about the race for the New York Post. There was a grassroots effort among Jewish Republicans and other Israel supporters to cross party lines and to change their registration to Democrat to try to prevent her from being the nominee because, people were so alarmed, and that failed. The Democrat, the more moderate Democrat was defeated. Steve Irwin is his name. And so Summer Lee was the nominee, and she ran against Mike Doyle, a Republican. Apparently she's just won. There was in addition to the grassroots efforts, which have been going on for months, APAC tried to, just to support the Republican in this case because she's viewed as so very anti-Israel, Summer Lee. And I do know, I can add to the piece I wrote for JNS. I've talked to a few people since then, Jewish Democrats who did cross over and vote for Mike Doyle. And some of them said it was the first time they'd ever voted for a Republican in their lives. However, it wasn't enough. And there was also a lot of support for Summer Lee within the Jewish community, even though she's very highly critical of Israel and very radical. She refused to give an interview to the Jewish newspaper in Pittsburgh, the Jewish Chronicle. And my take on it is I think she's honest about what she believes. I'm not a fan of what she believes, but I think she just made no secret. At that point, she just refused to even speak with them, which was a real diss. So I think we've got another squad member on the way to Washington, part supported by by a lot of people, but with significant support from within the Jewish community.
Well, here again, I think, the partisanship that we spoke about earlier just shows itself. People vote for Team Blue. If you have a D after your name, even if you are somebody who, really is a foe of Israel, you're still going to get a lot of Jewish votes, maybe the majority of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know that it was the majority, honestly, Jonathan. I had the impression most of the Jewish, again, unscientific polling here, but most of the Jewish people I spoke with in Pittsburgh, even those who were voting for Josh Shapiro and were voting for Fetterman. Several of them voted for Doyle for the Republicans. So I would hazard a guess that the majority of the Jewish community did not support Summer Lee. But the Jewish community's efforts were not enough to influence that race, and she's headed to Washington. But we know where she stands. I mean, for what that's worth. I don't
No,
think she's.
yes, we do. Yes, we do. And I
Mhm.
I think it points to the fact that as much as a lot of attention still goes to the original four members of the squad, the congressional squad. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley. Their numbers grew in 2020, and they're going to grow yet again in this cycle. They're making up a considerable portion now of the progressive caucus. In the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. It's likely to be a minority, and I think one of the things that shows that each side is getting more partisan. The Republicans, who will make up the narrow what appears to be a narrow majority in the House, are going to be more conservative, and the minority Democrats are going to be more liberal or really more leftist.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, not good. I mean, not good in terms of getting things done for the American people. That all this hyper partisanship, in my opinion. But we got another couple years of I guess the status quo, and then we got 2024. So
And
that's
that's a
that.
great segue to I think the next topic we should talk about is the impact of what we just saw in the midterms on the 2024 race, because of course the 2024 presidential race starts now. It's 2 years until November 2024, but the presidential race has already started. In fact, I think it kind of began last weekend with former President Donald Trump, teasing the fact that he's going to declare for the presidency again. He wants to be Grover Cleveland, be a non-consecutive presidency, and I think one of the reasons why he's getting in so early, which in a sense doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to wait and gives you more freedom of action in terms of fundraising and other things, because he's trying to scare, intimidate, or just preempt other Republicans from competing against him. Now, I think that's interesting because Trump still seems to have, by far the most support among any Republican. The polls show it. People are still very devoted to him within the Republican Party. And I think he was mainly worried, and I think we saw that this past weekend, about Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who has sort of become a folk hero to conservatives over the last 2 years because he stands on the coronavirus pandemic, standing up to sort of woke education, woke indoctrination in the schools, standing up to Disney. His stands on illegal immigration, and Trump was watching, even though Trump, was a supporter of DeSantis 4 years ago, was watching his growing reputation with sort of fear and loathing, and even tried out a derogatory nickname for him over the weekend, actually in a Pennsylvania rally, which I think didn't go over that well, sort of with Pennsylvanians who wanted him to be talking about their race. And I don't think it went over that well with national Republicans either, insulting a Republican just before the midterms. But now I think it sort of rings even more hollow after what happened last night, where as much as Republicans, didn't do as well as their expectations for them around the country, DeSantis exceeded expectations. He's
Yeah.
transformed Florida into a deep red state. He won his reelection race by a landslide. He got almost 60% of the vote. And I think if he was already thinking about running for president, and by all accounts, I believe he was, and with a lot of people support, a lot of money behind him, I think that result, as well as the insult that Trump threw at him, is going to make it even more likely that he will challenge Trump. And I think that sets up an interesting sort of competition among Jewish conservatives, Jewish Republicans, who are very grateful to Trump as the most pro-Israel president in history, but also like Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, I'm a little torn. I'll tell you that, Jonathan. And I guess that's the way things go. But I was a little, personally sorry to see Trump, you know, attacking him like that. I think DeSantis has delivered great results in general, from what I understand, to Floridians. And yeah, I mean, part of me, I think Trump has done. I think he did a very good job as president overall. I think that, though, I candidly, I think that a segment of the country would not allow him to be good for the country, if that makes sense. I think there's such a
I mean, the way
massive.
they tried to not allow him when he was president,
Yeah, I
with
think there
the
was just
Russia collusion hoax and the
yes, just
resistance.
the harassment and the continuous villainization of him, and the way much of the media hated him, I think was such a, I think he succeeded in many respects despite that, but that's a huge albatross on anyone. I mean, and I think that would continue and intensify. He is the lightning rod for so much rage and anger, which I have a lot of ideas about, but without getting into all my theories, I do wonder if someone else, who's a fresher candidate could emerge, and in
Maybe
DeSantis.
won't turn 80 during the next presidential term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
Yeah.
personally. I mean, I think age is so relative from person to person that I think he's a young 80, but I think that I think that a certain segment of the country won't allow him to be good for the country. They will, rather see the country suffer than see Trump succeed. And for whatever reason or reasons, they're obsessed with the hatred of him. So I mean, there's a part of me that just, even though I think what he did was, I think he's a historic figure, and, he broke through establishment politics and actually delivered and all that for us. I think it's unfortunate, but the reality may be that in a broad sense, his presidency, while effective in terms of policy and in terms of improving people's quality of life and the safety and security of our cities and our country, which matters to me, a lot of people were still apoplectic over it and over him for whatever reason. And so maybe it isn't the best thing for him to run
Well,
but
he certainly doesn't think so. It's clear that he is itching for revenge for 2020.
yeah.
I don't think there's anything in the world that will stop him from running. I think there are a couple of sort of counter arguments in there. In that, number one, I think Republicans have to understand that anybody that they nominate, including Ron DeSantis, will be demonized just as Trump has been demonized. In fact, the same day that Trump was trying out a derogatory nickname for DeSantis, the New York Times was focusing on DeSantis, and they published an article taking a deep dive into Ron DeSantis's break year in between college and law school, where he taught and coached baseball at a prep school in Georgia. Obviously, they sent someone down there to find looking for some scandal. They came up with nothing. It was a complete nothing burger of an article,
Well,
and in fact, I wonder
they
why
were
they
going to go after anybody, so
published
it's
it.
like has to be a Boy Scout. Yeah, yeah. He must be. He
I
must
mean,
be.
and even if he is a Boy Scout, they're still going to try and call him names and do anything to him. And I think DeSantis and other Republicans also have to factor in what would Trump's reaction be if he actually did lose the primaries. Would he support the Republican nominee? Would he just tell his supporters to take their football and go home, and not support the person who beat him, assuming someone could beat him? And that's a big if, very theoretical. Right now, Trump would still be the favorite to win the Republican nomination, and even if DeSantis got in, or other Republicans certainly will be encouraged because Trump comes out of the midterms looking a little weaker than he did. But I think they have to worry whether Trump has an effective veto over the Republican nomination, just because they'd be afraid that he wouldn't accept defeat.
Yeah, I guess Republicans are divided too. There's that division that those who support Trump tend to really support him, and those who don't hate him, but they're more
Well, I think
you
some
know
are looking for a change. Some want someone different who doesn't have the same baggage. Even listen, and I think what you said is right. Trump was, I think, in many ways the most successful conservative president, of the last half century, and that includes Ronald Reagan, who was a great president, but he sort of was a speed bump to the liberals. He was trying to stop the liberal train. Trump tried to turn it around, and until the coronavirus pandemic was largely successful. But we'll see how that plays out. Now, on the other side of the divide, I think it's interesting to speculate how this is going to affect Joe Biden. Now, I think, I spoke to Ari Fleischer in my last podcast episode, and Ari predicted that, within a couple of months of the midterms, which he anticipated, as most people did, being a big Republican victory, that the Democratic Party would just be telling, congressional delegations would go to Biden and say, you've got to announce you're not running for reelection. We can't go forward with you. Now, I think there's still, powerful arguments against Joe Biden continuing, trying for another 4 years. He seems to be much diminished, and I say that as someone who interviewed him and saw him. I mean, he doesn't seem to be the same person. He's still upright. He's still, I think, probably in some ways running the show. I don't think he's a complete, that people exaggerate, but he's clearly diminished. But I think this sort of equivocal result coming out of the midterms makes it more likely that he'll stay and try to hold on. I mean, after all, he spent his whole life, and I certainly, as somebody who followed him over the years and met him, talked to him, he spent his whole life trying to become president. He will be dragged out of the White House kicking and screaming. And had this been a disaster for the Democrats, and certainly it wasn't it wasn't a rollicking success. They appear to have lost the House and still have a theoretical chance of losing the Senate, but it looks like they've held on. But I think he's going to use this as ammunition to stay and say, no, I'm still the guy who can beat Trump. Whether that's true or not, because the poll matchups show Trump probably winning, or at least coming in even with Biden right now. What do you think about Joe Biden's future?
I think your analysis is good, Jonathan. I mean, I would have thought that the Democrats were going to dump Biden, but and I think there were some indicators that they were. But yeah, but apparently they seem to think that what the status quo is good enough, based on these midterms. I guess, the inflation and the chaotic border and the unwinnable war and the crime is good enough for them. I mean, I hate to say it, but they didn't send the Democrats packing. So I guess we're in for more of these things and more of Biden, maybe. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's that part's a little bit of a surprise. I would have thought people would have demanded more of their elected officials, but apparently not yet. We're not yet at the point where people, have had enough. So, I guess, and maybe it's a good thing for the Republicans in the sense that if they do put Biden and Harris up again, maybe we'll see, a Republican administration in 2024 once people have more of, crime and inflation, unwinnable wars, and a chaotic border.
Well, I think I think Republicans have to feel they have a better than even shot in 2024, given how the Biden administration has gone this far. But I think if we've learned anything of the last week, is that you can never figure out politics, and as much as we think we have it figured out, the only constant is change. Things always, whatever you think is happening, things always change. And indeed, one of the foibles of being a daily journalist and covering things and writing about events. Is that you can get too caught up in the story of the moment and not see the big picture and not see changes that are coming down the pike. We don't know what's going to happen in 2024. Right now, the most likely matchup right now is Biden versus Trump, as sort of gobsmacking as that I think might be for most Americans, that they would say, can't we do better than these, trotting these two fellows out again?
Think it might be
But
Biden.
that may be what will happen.
I think it may be DeSantis, Jonathan. I think that Republicans, and I say this as somebody who thinks highly of the former president in many ways, but it may be that his moment has passed.
Well,
I
I
don't.
think certainly, I think Ron DeSantis is going to give it a try, and if after coming after this, triumph in Florida, where if he may well decide that although he's a young man, he could wait one or two presidential cycles and still be viable. His moment will have passed if he doesn't strike now. The odds will probably be against him because Trump is so popular, has such a stranglehold on the Republican Party and on the affection, I think, of the Republican grassroots. But we'll see how that turns out. But
I'm not as total as you think. I think that people have, a lot of great respect for Trump, and I say this from within the pro-Trump, younger wing of the Republican Party. But I do think that there's a sense that, you know, that there's something to be said for giving someone else a chance, and it would be so wonderful if President Trump could be that kingmaker, if he could, find it within to say, pass the torch to a DeSantis or someone else who's had, good results. I know that doesn't seem consistent with some of his, style, but
I don't think
he's
it's consistent with anything we know about him. I'll just stop and say, people make a lot of comparisons between American politics and Israeli politics, most of which are entirely misleading. But there's one thing that you could draw an analogy. In Israel, certainly Benjamin Netanyahu, who won a strong victory last week in the last Knesset election, is about to form a new government. As much as people have wanted, and in fact, had he stepped aside, Israel wouldn't have gone through 5 elections in less than 3 years. But he never groomed a successor, and he doesn't appear to believe in the concept. I think that's the same is true for Donald Trump. He does not believe in successors. As long as he's on his feet, he's going to keep going until he's constitutionally forbidden from running again. I don't think there's any reason in the world to believe that he will gracefully step aside for Ron DeSantis or anyone else. I think, as I said before, that sets up an interesting dilemma for the pro-Israel community, because if that is the matchup, and certainly other candidates may go in, Nikki Haley is another person who will likely jump into the race as well, although I think she would be a long shot. Ron DeSantis is another strong supporter of Israel. He was the chair of the Congressional Israel Victory Caucus organized by the Middle East Forum when he was in Congress. And I know there were a lot of pro-Israel activists who weren't that happy when they learned he was running for governor 4 years ago, because they thought that's going to be a loss for Israel in Washington. But he may come back as a pro-Israel. He wants to come back as a pro-Israel president, and obviously Trump has the pro-Israel credentials too. So that will be an interesting debate.
Yes, and I just would send out a respectful, plea to our former president and those of us, who saw his greatness. We just, in terms of practicality being important, we would, ask him to consider that, to consider choosing a successor and being, the elder statesman who, is the wind and, behind, somebody new for us who can challenge the establishment.
Well, I don't think I don't think so. I don't think even a lot of his supporters would go for that either. But we'll see what happens. Heather, I want to thank you so much for coming on and offering your insights. Your reporting on the election was great. We look forward to seeing more of your work in JNS. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications. Give us good reviews. Remember to log on to see Top Story Daily Edition on Spotify and the other podcast platforms. It's not video, just audio. Please write to us at editor@jns.org. Let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.